What if everything you thought you knew about your marriage was only half the story? What if the person you loved most had been keeping a secret so beautiful, so life-changing, that discovering it after their death would either destroy you or give you the greatest gift imaginable? This is the story of Elizabeth Carter, a woman whose world was about to be turned upside down by a small girl in a pink dress and a truth that would redefine everything she believed about love, loss, and family. The autumn rain had been falling for 3 days straight, turning the world into a watercolor painting of grays and muted browns. Elizabeth Carter stood at her kitchen window, watching the drops streak down the glass like tears she no longer had the energy to cry. At 57, she felt ancient, as if Arthur's death had aged her decades in mere months. The house felt impossibly large without him. Every room echoed with memories that both comforted and tormented her. The living room where they'd spent countless evenings reading together. The kitchen where Arthur had attempted to surprise her with breakfast in bed every anniversary, always burning the toast just slightly. Even the hallway seemed to whisper his name with every creak of the old floorboards. But it was the cemetery that called to her most strongly. Millbrook Cemetery had become her second home, a place where she could feel close to Arthur without the overwhelming emptiness of their shared spaces. The polished granite headstone had become her confessor, the one place where she could speak freely about the crushing weight of her grief. Today was no different. Despite the rain, despite the chill that seemed to seep into her very bones, Elizabeth found herself reaching for her coat. The daily pilgrimage couldn't be interrupted by something as trivial as weather. The drive to the cemetery was a blur of familiar streets and half-remembered landmarks. How many times had she and Arthur driven the same route to visit other graves, to pay respects to friends and family who had passed before them? She'd never imagined then that she would be making this journey alone, that she would be the one left behind. The cemetery gates loomed ahead, their iron bars slick with rain. Elizabeth parked in her usual spot, the one that gave her the shortest walk to Arthur's grave. As she approached the headstone, she noticed that someone had been there recently. Fresh flowers lay scattered around the base, not the roses she'd brought yesterday, but simple wildflowers that looked like they'd been picked from the meadow beyond the cemetery walls. Who could have left these? She wondered aloud, kneeling to examine the flowers more closely. They were white daisies and baby's breath, arranged with the careful precision of someone who truly cared. The discovery unsettled her. Arthur had been gone for 6 months now, and aside from the funeral, she couldn't remember anyone else visiting his grave. A flash of movement caught her eye. Through the rain, she saw a small figure moving between the headstones. Elizabeth squinted, trying to make out details through the gray haze. It was a child, a little girl wearing what appeared to be a bright pink dress, completely inappropriate for the weather. The girl moved with purpose, as if she knew exactly where she was going. Elizabeth watched, transfixed, as the child approached Arthur's grave. Without hesitation, the girl knelt in the muddy grass and began arranging more wildflowers around the headstone, her small hands working with practiced efficiency. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't a random visit or a case of mistaken identity. This child knew Arthur's grave, had been here before, perhaps many times. But who was she? Where were her parents? And why did she seem to share such an intimate connection with Arthur's final resting place? The girl couldn't have been more than 8 years old, her dark skin a stark contrast to the pale pink of her dress. Even from a distance, Elizabeth could see that the dress was worn and slightly too small, as if it had been outgrown but was still treasured. The child's movements were gentle, reverent, as if she were tending to something precious. Elizabeth found herself frozen, unsure whether to approach or retreat. Part of her wanted to demand answers, to know who this child was and why she was intruding on what felt like private grief. But another part of her, the part that had been a teacher for 30 years before retirement, recognized something in the girl's posture that spoke of deep, genuine sorrow. The rain began to fall harder, and Elizabeth watched as the little girl pulled a small piece of paper from her pocket. She seemed to be reading from it, her lips moving silently. Then, to Elizabeth's amazement, the child began to speak aloud, her voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. "I hope you're not too cold up there." the girl said, her small voice carrying a maturity that seemed far beyond her years. I brought you the flowers you liked. The white ones from the meadow. I remember you said they reminded you of snow. But happy snow, not the sad kind. Elizabeth felt her heart constrict. The girl was speaking to Arthur as if she knew him, as if they had shared conversations about flowers and weather and the kinds of details that only came from genuine familiarity. How was this possible? The child continued, her voice growing stronger despite the rain. I'm trying to be brave like you taught me, but it's hard, really hard. I miss our talks, and I miss the way you'd read me stories with all the funny voices. Mrs. Thompson says I should talk to you sometimes, that you might still be listening somehow. Mrs. Thompson, the name meant nothing to Elizabeth, but the intimacy in the girl's tone, the way she spoke of Arthur as if he'd been a central figure in her life, sent shockwaves through Elizabeth's already fragile emotional state. I'm scared, the girl continued, her voice now thick with unshed tears. I'm scared I'll forget your voice, or the way you smiled when you brought me books. I'm scared that without you, I'll never have a real family. The words hit Elizabeth like a physical blow. This child, whoever she was, had clearly loved Arthur deeply. But more than that, she spoke of him as if he'd been a father figure, someone who had promised her a family. The implications were staggering. As the rain continued to fall, Elizabeth watched the girl sit back on her heels, her small shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Every instinct Elizabeth possessed screamed at her to go to the child, to offer comfort, to demand answers. But her feet remained rooted to the spot, her mind reeling with possibilities she wasn't ready to consider. The girl stayed at the grave for another few minutes, speaking in tones too low for Elizabeth to hear. Then, as suddenly as she'd appeared, the child rose to her feet, kissed her fingertips, and pressed them gently to Arthur's headstone. With one final look around the cemetery, she turned and walked away, her pink dress a bright spot of color against the gray landscape. Elizabeth stood frozen long after the girl had disappeared, her mind racing with questions that seemed to have no answers. Who was this child? How had she known Arthur? And why had Arthur never mentioned her? The rain had soaked through Elizabeth's coat, but she barely noticed. She approached Arthur's grave with trembling steps, kneeling where the girl had been moments before. The fresh flowers were already wilting in the rain, but their presence felt like a message, a sign that Arthur's life had touched more people than Elizabeth had ever known. Arthur, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. Who was she? What aren't you telling me? But the granite headstone offered no answers, only her own reflection staring back at her from its polished surface. Elizabeth placed her own flowers beside the ones the girl had left, her fingers tracing the familiar letters of Arthur's name. For the first time since his death, she felt as if she were sharing this space with someone else, someone who had loved him just as deeply as she had. The drive home was a blur of rain-slicked streets and unanswered questions. Elizabeth's mind kept returning to the girl's words, to the familiarity in her voice when she spoke to Arthur. The phrase real family echoed in her thoughts, carrying implications that she wasn't ready to fully explore. At home, Elizabeth moved through her evening routine like a sleepwalker. She made dinner she couldn't taste, watched television programs she couldn't focus on, and tried to read books whose words might as well have been written in a foreign language. Everything felt surreal, as if the encounter at the cemetery had shifted the very foundations of her reality. That night, sleep eluded her completely. Elizabeth lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind turning over every detail of the afternoon's encounter. The girl's voice, her obvious grief, the way she'd spoken to Arthur as if he'd been a constant presence in her life. It all pointed to a relationship that Elizabeth had known nothing about. A connection that Arthur had somehow kept secret. The possibility that Arthur had been keeping secrets from her was almost as painful as his death itself. Their marriage had been built on trust, on the belief that they shared everything. The idea that he might have had an entire relationship, possibly even a relationship with a child, that she knew nothing about, shook her to her core. But even as doubt crept in, Elizabeth found herself remembering the girl's obvious love for Arthur, the reverence with which she tended to his grave. Whatever the truth was, it was clear that Arthur had meant something profound to this child. And despite her confusion and hurt, Elizabeth couldn't help but feel a grudging respect for the girl's dedication. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, matching Elizabeth's mood perfectly. She went through her morning routine mechanically, her mind still consumed by the previous day's encounter. Over breakfast, she found herself studying Arthur's photograph on the mantelpiece, searching his familiar features for any sign of the secrets he might have been keeping. The photograph had been taken just months before his death. At their friend's anniversary party, Arthur was smiling broadly, his arm around Elizabeth's shoulders, his eyes crinkled with the kind of joy that had always made her fall in love with him all over again. But now, looking at that same smile, Elizabeth wondered what else might have been behind it. A knock at the door interrupted her brooding. Elizabeth glanced at the clock, surprised to see that it was barely 9 in the morning. She wasn't expecting anyone, and it was too early for the usual deliveries or solicitations. She opened the door to find her neighbor, Mrs. Harrison, standing on the porch with a concerned expression and a covered casserole dish. "Elizabeth, dear," Mrs. Harrison said, her voice filled with the kind of gentle concern that had become all too familiar since Arthur's death. "I was making extra lasagna and thought you might like some. You've been looking a bit peaked lately." Elizabeth managed a weak smile, accepting the dish gratefully. Mrs. Harrison had been incredibly kind since Arthur's passing, frequently bringing meals and checking in on her. It was the sort of neighborly care that Elizabeth had always appreciated, even if it sometimes made her feel like an object of pity. "Thank you, Mrs. Harrison. That's very thoughtful of you. How are you holding up, dear?" Mrs. Harrison asked, her eyes searching Elizabeth's face with the practiced concern of someone who had seen her share of grief. "I know these first holidays without Arthur are going to be difficult." Elizabeth nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. The mention of holidays brought a fresh wave of pain. She and Arthur had always made such a production of Halloween, Thanksgiving, Christmas. The house would be filled with decorations. The kitchen would smell of Arthur's ambitious cooking experiments, and they would spend hours planning gifts for their nieces and nephews. "I'm managing," Elizabeth said finally, the same response she'd been giving everyone for months. "Some days are harder than others." Mrs. Harrison nodded sympathetically. "Well, you know you're not alone. The whole neighborhood is here for you. If you need anything at all, you just let us know." After Mrs. Harrison left, Elizabeth sat at her kitchen table, staring at the covered casserole dish. The kindness of her neighbors had been overwhelming since Arthur's death, but it also served as a constant reminder of her loss. Every covered dish, every concerned phone call, every gentle inquiry about her well-being was a testament to the fact that she was now alone in the world. But was she really alone? The image of the girl in the pink dress flashed through her mind again. If Arthur had indeed formed a relationship with this child, if he had been a father figure to her, then perhaps Elizabeth wasn't the only one mourning his loss. Perhaps there was someone else out there who understood the depth of her grief, who had loved Arthur just as deeply as she had. The thought was both comforting and terrifying. If such a relationship existed, why had Arthur kept it secret? What else about their marriage had been hidden from her? And more importantly, what responsibility did she now have to this child who had clearly been affected by Arthur's death? Elizabeth spent the rest of the day in a state of anxious anticipation. She found herself checking the clock repeatedly, watching the hours tick by until it would be time for her usual visit to the cemetery. Would the girl be there again? Would Elizabeth finally have the courage to approach her? As afternoon faded into evening, Elizabeth made her way to the cemetery once more. The rain had stopped, but the air still held that heavy, moisture-laden quality that promised more storms to come. The cemetery was quieter than usual, with only a few other visitors scattered among the headstones. Elizabeth approached Arthur's grave with cautious steps, her eyes scanning the area for any sign of the mysterious girl. The flowers from yesterday were still there, now wilted and brown. But there was no sign of fresh additions. Elizabeth felt a stab of disappointment that surprised her with its intensity. She knelt beside the headstone, replacing the old flowers with fresh ones from her garden. As she worked, she found herself speaking to Arthur in a way she hadn't since his death. Not with the usual litany of grief and longing, but with questions that demanded answers. "Arthur," she said softly, her fingers tracing the letters of his name. "I need to know who she is. That little girl, the one who clearly loves you so much. I need to know what you were keeping from me." The wind rustled through the trees, and for a moment, Elizabeth could almost imagine it was Arthur's voice trying to reach her. But the rational part of her mind knew that the dead didn't speak, that whatever answers she needed would have to come from the living. As if summoned by her thoughts, Elizabeth heard the soft sound of footsteps on the gravel path. She looked up to see a familiar figure approaching through the gathering dusk. The girl in the pink dress was back, walking with the same purposeful stride Elizabeth had observed the day before. This time, Elizabeth was ready. She remained kneeling beside the headstone, making no sudden movements that might startle the child. As the girl drew closer, Elizabeth could see her face more clearly. She was indeed very young, probably no more than 8 or 9, with large, expressive eyes that seemed to hold far too much sadness for someone so small. The girl stopped short when she saw Elizabeth, her eyes widening with what appeared to be fear. For a moment, they stared at each other across the small distance that separated them, both frozen in uncertainty. "Hello," Elizabeth said softly, her voice as gentle as she could make it. "I'm Elizabeth. I'm Arthur's wife." The girl's eyes grew even wider, and she took a small step backward. Elizabeth could see that she was trembling, whether from cold or fear. She couldn't tell. "It's okay," Elizabeth continued, slowly rising to her feet but making no move to approach. "I'm not angry. I'd like to know who you are. I can see that you cared about Arthur very much." The girl's lower lip began to tremble, and Elizabeth realized that she was fighting back tears. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry," the girl said, her words thick with emotion. "I'm sorry for coming here. I know I shouldn't, but I miss him so much, and I don't know where else to go." Elizabeth felt her heart break at the raw pain in the child's voice. Whatever the circumstances of her relationship with Arthur, it was clear that his death had left this little girl devastated. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Elizabeth asked, taking a careful step closer. The girl looked up at her with eyes that seemed to hold the weight of the world. "Maya," she whispered. "My name is Maya." "Maya," Elizabeth repeated, testing the name on her tongue. "That's a beautiful name, Maya. Can you tell me how you knew Arthur?" Maya's face crumpled, and the tears she'd been holding back finally spilled over. "He was going to be my daddy," she said, her voice breaking with the weight of her grief. "He was going to take me home and be my daddy. But then he died, and now I don't have anybody." The words hit Elizabeth like a physical blow. She staggered backward, her hand flying to her chest as if she could somehow contain the pain that was spreading through her entire body. Arthur had been planning to adopt a child? He had been going to be a father, and she had known nothing about it? "I don't understand," Elizabeth said, her voice barely audible. "What do you mean? He was going to be your daddy?" Maya wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving streaks of dirt on her cheeks. "He came to see me every week," she said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "He brought me books and toys, and he helped me when I was sick. He said he was going to take me home to live with him and his wife. He said you would be my mommy." Elizabeth felt the world spinning around her. She reached out blindly, her hand finding the solid surface of Arthur's headstone, using it to steady herself as Maya's words sank in. "He talked about me?" Elizabeth asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Maya nodded eagerly, and for the first time since Elizabeth had seen her, the girl's face lit up with something approaching joy. "All the time," she said. "He said you were the kindest person he ever met, and that you had so much love to give." He said you always wanted a little girl, and that you would make the best mommy in the whole world. Elizabeth's knees gave way, and she sank down onto the bench beside Arthur's grave. The revelation was too much to process. Arthur had found them a daughter, had been planning to surprise her with the child they had always dreamed of having, and now he was gone, leaving both Elizabeth and Maya alone in their grief. "Where do you live now?" Elizabeth asked, her voice thick with emotion. Maya's face fell, and she looked down at her feet. "At the orphanage," she said quietly. "Sunnyside Orphanage. But I don't like it there. It's not the same as having a real family." Elizabeth's heart clenched at the word orphanage. This poor child had been living in an institution, probably surrounded by other children who had also lost everything, and Arthur had been planning to rescue her from that life, to give her the family she so desperately needed. "Maya," Elizabeth said softly, "can you tell me more about Arthur? About the time you spent with him?" Maya's face brightened again, and she moved closer to Elizabeth, as if drawn by the opportunity to share memories of the man they both loved. "He was so funny," Maya said, her voice growing animated. "He used to make up voices for all the characters in the books he read to me, and he always brought me my favorite candy, the ones with the sour centers. He said they reminded him of me because I was sweet on the inside but could be a little sour when I was upset." Elizabeth couldn't help but smile at this description. It sounded exactly like something Arthur would say, the kind of gentle teasing that had always been part of his charm. "He taught me how to play chess," Maya continued, her words tumbling out in a rush as if she was afraid Elizabeth might stop listening. "And he helped me with my reading. I wasn't very good at first, but he was so patient. He never got mad when I made mistakes." As Maya spoke, Elizabeth found herself seeing Arthur in a completely new light. She had always known he would make a wonderful father, but hearing about his relationship with Maya made her realize just how much love he had been ready to give to a child who needed it. "He was sick for a while before he died," Maya said, her voice growing quieter. "He couldn't come see me as much, but he still called me every day. He promised me that as soon as he felt better, he would start the papers to make me officially his daughter. He said he couldn't wait for me to meet you." Elizabeth felt tears streaming down her cheeks. Arthur had been planning this surprise even while he was ill, even when he must have known that his time was limited. The depth of his love for both her and Maya was overwhelming. "Maya," Elizabeth said, her voice shaking with emotion, "I need you to know something. Arthur loved you very much, and if he had lived, if he had been able to bring you home, I would have been so happy to be your mommy." Maya's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they seemed to be tears of something approaching hope rather than pure grief. "Really?" Maya asked, her voice small and uncertain. "Really," Elizabeth confirmed, reaching out to gently touch Maya's hand. "Arthur chose you to be our daughter, and that means you're very special indeed." They sat together in the gathering darkness, sharing memories of Arthur and slowly beginning to understand the connection that bound them together. Elizabeth learned that Maya had been at the orphanage for over a year, that she had been very sick when Arthur first met her, and that his support had not only provided her with medical care but had also given her the hope of a real family. As the evening grew later, Elizabeth realized that Maya would need to return to the orphanage soon. The thought of this child going back to that institutional setting, knowing now what Arthur had planned for her, was almost unbearable. "Maya," Elizabeth said carefully, "I'd like to visit you at the orphanage, if that would be okay with you. I'd like to learn more about you and about your friendship with Arthur." Maya's face lit up with a joy that transformed her entire appearance. "You would do that?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder. "I would love to," Elizabeth replied, and she realized that she meant it completely. This child represented a part of Arthur that she had never known, and she found herself desperate to understand that part of him. As they prepared to leave the cemetery, Maya turned back to Arthur's headstone one more time. "Thank you for bringing Elizabeth to me," she said softly. "I think you would be happy that we found each other." Elizabeth felt a lump form in her throat. In her grief, She had been so focused on what Arthur's death had taken from her that she had never considered what he might have left behind. Maya wasn't just a reminder of Arthur's secrets. She was a living testament to his love, his hope for their future, and his desire to create a family. The next morning, Elizabeth woke with a sense of purpose that she hadn't felt since Arthur's death. She had a mission now, a reason to get out of bed that went beyond the simple mechanics of survival. She was going to visit Maya at the orphanage, and she was going to learn everything she could about this child who had been so important to Arthur. The drive to Sunnyside Orphanage took her through parts of the city she rarely visited, past rundown buildings and empty lots that spoke of urban decay and forgotten dreams. The orphanage itself was a large, institutional-looking building that seemed to have been constructed with function rather than comfort in mind. Elizabeth parked her car and sat for a moment, gathering her courage. She was about to enter a world that was completely foreign to her, and she wasn't sure what to expect. But Maya was in there, and that was enough to propel her forward. The receptionist who greeted her was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. When Elizabeth explained that she was there to inquire about Maya, the woman's expression grew serious. "Are you a relative?" the receptionist asked, her voice professional but cautious. "Not exactly," Elizabeth replied. "I'm the widow of Arthur Carter. I believe he was involved in Maya's care." The receptionist's eyes widened with recognition. "Oh, you're Elizabeth," she said, her voice softening. "Maya has mentioned you. Let me get Mrs. Thompson. She's our director." And she knew Arthur well. Elizabeth waited in a small office that was clearly designed to be welcoming but somehow managed to feel institutional despite the attempts at warmth. When Mrs. Thompson arrived, she was a woman in her 50s with graying hair and the kind of competent air that suggested she had seen everything the world could throw at her. "Mrs. Carter," Mrs. Thompson said, extending her hand. "I'm so sorry for your loss. Arthur was a remarkable man, and his death was a terrible shock to all of us, especially to Maya." Elizabeth shook the woman's hand, noting the genuine warmth in her grip. "Thank you. I have to admit, I'm still trying to understand Arthur's connection to Maya. I had no idea he was involved with the orphanage." Mrs. Thompson's expression grew understanding. "Arthur was very private about his work here," she said. "He specifically asked us not to contact you until he was ready to discuss it himself. He wanted it to be a surprise." "Can you tell me about their relationship?" Elizabeth asked, settling into the chair across from Mrs. Thompson's desk. Mrs. Thompson nodded, her expression growing thoughtful. "Arthur first came to us about 18 months ago. He had heard about Maya through a friend who volunteers here. Maya had been very sick, and she needed extensive medical treatment that was beyond what our basic insurance could cover. Arthur offered to help with the costs, but he wanted to do more than just write a check." Elizabeth listened intently as Mrs. Thompson described how Arthur had begun visiting Maya regularly, how he had become a father figure to her, and how he had gradually begun the process of legal adoption. "He was planning to surprise you with the adoption papers," Mrs. Thompson explained. "He had been working with our lawyers to get everything in order. Maya was going to be his Christmas present to you." Elizabeth felt her breath catch. Christmas was still months away, but Arthur had been planning that far ahead, preparing to give her the gift she had always wanted most. "Where is Maya now?" Elizabeth asked, suddenly desperate to see the child. "She's in class," Mrs. Thompson replied. "We have a small school here for the children, but I could call her out if you'd like to see her." Elizabeth nodded eagerly, and Mrs. Thompson made the call. Within minutes, Maya appeared in the doorway, her face lighting up when she saw Elizabeth. "You came," Maya said, her voice filled with wonder and joy. "I promised I would," Elizabeth replied, opening her arms as Maya rushed forward. The hug they shared was fierce and desperate, as if they were both trying to hold on to something precious that might slip away. Elizabeth could feel Maya's small body trembling against her, and she realized that this child had been carrying the weight of Arthur's death all alone. "Maya," Elizabeth said softly, I want to know everything about you. I want to know about your life, your dreams, your favorite things. I want to understand why Arthur loved you so much." Maya pulled back, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "He really talked about me?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. "According to Mrs. Thompson, he talked about you all the time," Elizabeth replied. "He was so excited about bringing you home, about making you part of our family." Maya's face crumpled, and she began to cry in earnest. "But now he's gone," she sobbed, "and I'll never have a real family." Elizabeth felt something shift inside her chest, a protective instinct that she had never experienced before. She pulled Maya closer, stroking her hair and murmuring comforting words. "Sweetheart," Elizabeth said softly, "what if I told you that Arthur's dream doesn't have to die with him? What if I told you that I would like to continue what he started?" Maya looked up at her with eyes wide with hope and disbelief. "What do you mean?" she whispered. Elizabeth took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would change both their lives forever. "I mean that I would like to be your mommy. If you'll have me, I would like to take you home and give you the family that Arthur wanted you to have." Maya's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. She threw her arms around Elizabeth's neck, sobbing with a mixture of joy and relief that was heartbreaking to witness. "Yes," Maya cried, her voice muffled against Elizabeth's shoulder. "Yes, please. I want that more than anything." Elizabeth held Maya close, feeling a sense of rightness settle over her. This was what Arthur had wanted for them, what he had been working toward in secret. In caring for Maya, Elizabeth wouldn't just be honoring Arthur's memory. She would be completing the family he had dreamed of creating. The process of adoption was more complex than Elizabeth had imagined, involving countless meetings with social workers, lawyers, and child psychologists. But with Mrs. Thompson's help and Maya's enthusiastic cooperation, they navigated the bureaucracy with determination and hope. During the weeks that followed, Elizabeth visited Maya almost daily, learning about her interests, her fears, and her dreams. Maya was a bright, articulate child who loved to read and had a natural talent for art. She had been in the orphanage system for most of her life, bouncing between foster homes and institutions, never quite finding the permanent family she longed for. "Arthur was the first person who ever made me feel like I belonged somewhere," Maya told Elizabeth one afternoon as they sat in the orphanage's small library. "He made me feel like I was worth choosing." Elizabeth felt tears prick her eyes. "You are worth choosing, Maya. You're worth choosing 1,000 times over." As they spent more time together, Elizabeth began to see glimpses of the woman Maya might become. She was intelligent and curious, with a dry sense of humor that reminded Elizabeth strongly of Arthur. She had survived tremendous hardship with a resilience that was both admirable and heartbreaking. "I used to dream about having a mom," Maya confided one day as they worked on a jigsaw puzzle together. "I would imagine what she would look like, what she would sound like, how she would hug me when I was sad. But I never imagined she would be as wonderful as you." Elizabeth's heart swelled with an emotion she had never experienced before. This was what maternal love felt like. She realized this fierce, protective, overwhelming desire to shield Maya from any further pain, to give her every happiness, to watch her grow and flourish. The day finally came when the adoption was officially approved. Elizabeth arrived at the orphanage to find Maya waiting with a small suitcase and the biggest smile Elizabeth had ever seen. "Is it really time?" Maya asked, her voice trembling with excitement. "It's really time," Elizabeth confirmed, taking Maya's hand. "Let's go home, sweetheart." The drive to Elizabeth's house was filled with Maya's excited chatter about her new room, her new school, and all the things she wanted to do now that she had a real family. Elizabeth found herself laughing more than she had in months, infected by Maya's joy and enthusiasm. When they arrived at the house, Elizabeth gave Maya a tour of what was now her home. Maya's eyes grew wide as she took in the comfortable furniture, the well-stocked bookshelves, and the warm, welcoming atmosphere that was so different from the institutional setting of the orphanage. "This is your room," Elizabeth said, opening the door to the room she had prepared. She had painted the walls a soft lavender color and filled the space with books, toys, and a beautiful quilted bedspread that she had made herself. Maya stood in the doorway, her eyes filling with tears. "It's the most beautiful room I've ever seen," she whispered. "Is it really mine?" "It's really yours," Elizabeth confirmed, pulling Maya into a hug. "Everything in this house is yours now, because you're my daughter." That night, as Elizabeth tucked Maya into bed for the first time, she felt a sense of completeness that she had never experienced before. Arthur's death had left a hole in her heart that she had thought would never heal, but caring for Maya had begun to fill that space with something new and beautiful. "Thank you for choosing me," Maya said sleepily, her small hand clutching Elizabeth's. "Thank you for letting me choose you," Elizabeth replied, kissing Maya's forehead. "Sweet dreams, my darling girl." As Elizabeth turned off the light and closed the door, she felt Arthur's presence more strongly than she had since his death. She could almost hear his voice, filled with the joy and satisfaction of a plan that had finally come to fruition. The months that followed were a time of adjustment and growth for both Elizabeth and Maya. They learned each other's rhythms, discovered shared interests, and slowly built the kind of easy intimacy that comes from truly belonging to each other. Maya flourished in her new environment. She excelled in her new school, made friends easily, and began to display a confidence and security that had been missing during her time at the orphanage. Elizabeth, meanwhile, found herself rejuvenated by the demands of motherhood, energized by Maya's needs and delighted by her accomplishments. One evening, as they sat on the porch swing that Elizabeth and Arthur had shared for so many years, Maya turned to Elizabeth with a serious expression. "I've been thinking about Arthur," Maya said carefully. "I still miss him, but I'm not as sad anymore. Is that okay?" Elizabeth smoothed Maya's hair, considering her words carefully. "Of course it's okay, sweetheart. Arthur loved you so much, and he wanted you to be happy. I think he would be pleased to know that you're healing." Maya nodded thoughtfully. "I think he would be happy that we found each other," she said. "I think he would like knowing that we're taking care of each other." Elizabeth felt a warmth spread through her chest. "I think you're absolutely right," she said. "I think Arthur is very happy indeed." As they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, Elizabeth reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. Arthur's death had been devastating, but it had also led her to Maya, and to a kind of love she had never experienced before. In the distance, she could hear the sound of children playing, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. Maya would be out there soon, playing with her new friends, secure in the knowledge that she had a home to return to, a family who loved her unconditionally. "I love you, Maya," Elizabeth said softly, pulling her daughter closer. "I love you too, Mom," Maya replied, and Elizabeth felt her heart swell with joy at the simple, perfect word. Arthur's plan had worked, even if he hadn't lived to see it come to fruition. He had found them each other, had created a family out of grief and loss and hope, and in caring for Maya, Elizabeth had found not just a daughter, but a renewed sense of purpose and a love that had healed her broken heart in ways she never thought possible. The kitchen smelled of pancakes and bacon, and Maya's laughter echoed through the house as she attempted to flip a pancake that was clearly too ambitious for her 8-year-old coordination. Elizabeth watched from the doorway, her heart full as she observed the scene of domestic happiness that had become their Saturday morning ritual. "Mom, I think I need help," Maya called out, holding the spatula at an awkward angle as batter dripped onto the stovetop. "I think you might be right," Elizabeth said, moving to stand beside her daughter. "Let me show you the trick Arthur taught me." It no longer hurt to mention Arthur's name. Over the months, he had become a beloved presence in their home rather than a source of pain. Elizabeth had filled the house with photographs of him, and Maya had contributed drawings and stories about the man who had brought them together. "He was a good teacher," Maya said, successfully flipping the pancake with Elizabeth's guidance. "I wish I could have learned more from him." "You did learn from him," Elizabeth replied, squeezing Maya's shoulder. You learned about love, about family, about how to be brave even when you're scared. Those are the most important lessons of all. Maya beamed up at her, and Elizabeth marveled at how much the child had grown. Not just physically but emotionally. The frightened, grieving girl she had met at the cemetery had blossomed into a confident, joyful child who filled their home with laughter and love. After breakfast, they made their weekly trip to the cemetery. It had become a family tradition, a way to honor Arthur's memory and to remind themselves of the journey that had brought them together. Maya no longer cried during these visits. Instead, she would tell Arthur about her week, her friends, her grades, and her dreams for the future. Arthur, Maya said, kneeling beside the headstone as Elizabeth arranged fresh flowers. I got an A on my art project. Mrs. Rodriguez said I have real talent, and Mom signed me up for art classes at the community center. Elizabeth smiled, listening to Maya's animated chatter. The child had indeed shown remarkable artistic ability, creating beautiful drawings and paintings that now decorated their refrigerator and filled several photo albums. And guess what? Maya continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I think Mom is happy now. Really happy. She smiles all the time, and she laughs at my jokes, even the bad ones. I think you would be proud of how good we are at taking care of each other. Elizabeth felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than grief. Maya was right. She was happy. Not the same kind of happiness she had shared with Arthur, but a different, equally profound contentment that came from watching a child grow and thrive under her care. I have something to tell you too, Arthur, Elizabeth said, settling onto the grass beside Maya. I've been thinking about going back to teaching. Maya thinks it's a good idea, and I realize I miss it. I miss helping children learn and grow. Maya looked up at her with bright eyes. You should do it, Mom. You're the best teacher I've ever had. And you haven't even been teaching me officially. Elizabeth laughed, ruffling Maya's hair. Well, if my daughter approves, then I suppose I should consider it seriously. As they prepared to leave the cemetery, Maya turned back to the headstone one more time. Thank you, Arthur, she said softly. Thank you for giving me the best mom in the world. Elizabeth felt her heart swell with emotion. In her grief, she had thought Arthur's death had ended their story, but instead, it had been the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with unexpected joy and the kind of love that transcends loss. The house was filled with the sounds of Maya's 10th birthday party. Children ran through the rooms, their laughter mixing with music and the general chaos of celebration. Elizabeth stood in the kitchen, watching through the window as Maya played with her friends in the backyard, and marveled at how much their lives had changed. She's a different child than the one I knew at the orphanage, Mrs. Thompson said, joining Elizabeth at the window. She had become a regular visitor, someone who had watched their family grow and flourish with professional pride and personal joy. She's helped me become a different person too, Elizabeth replied, cutting another slice of birthday cake. I never realized how much love I had to give until Maya came into my life. Mrs. Thompson smiled. Arthur knew. He saw it in you from the beginning. He told me once that you had the biggest heart of anyone he'd ever met, and that Maya would be lucky to have you as a mother. Elizabeth felt a familiar warmth at the mention of Arthur's name. I think I'm the lucky one, she said. Maya has taught me that love doesn't diminish when you share it. It multiplies. Later that evening, after the guests had gone home and the house had been cleaned, Elizabeth and Maya sat on the porch swing, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. Maya was still wearing her birthday tiara, a silly plastic crown that she had declared the best gift ever. Mom, Maya said suddenly, her voice serious despite the festive headwear. I want to ask you something. Of course, sweetheart. What is it? Maya fidgeted with the hem of her party dress. I've been thinking about my last name. I know it's Carter now, because you adopted me, but I was wondering, would it be okay if I changed it to Carter Arthur? I don't want to forget that he was part of our family too. Elizabeth felt her breath catch. The request was so thoughtful, so mature, and so perfectly Maya that she felt overwhelmed with pride. "I think that's a beautiful idea," Elizabeth said, pulling Maya closer. "I think Arthur would be honored." Maya snuggled against her mother's side, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars twinkle overhead. Elizabeth thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment, about the grief that had nearly destroyed her and the love that had ultimately saved them both. "Mom?" Maya said sleepily. "Yes, sweetheart? Do you think Arthur can see us? Do you think he knows how happy we are?" Elizabeth looked up at the stars, thinking about the man who had loved them both so much that he had found a way to bring them together even after his death. "I think he knows," she said softly. "I think he's very happy indeed." As Maya drifted off to sleep in her arms, Elizabeth reflected on the unexpected turns that life could take. She had thought Arthur's death was the end of their story, but instead, it had been the beginning of something beautiful and new. Maya had given her a reason to live again, a purpose that went beyond grief and loss. The night was peaceful, filled with the sounds of crickets and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. Elizabeth held her daughter close, grateful for the love that had brought them together and for the future that stretched out before them, bright with possibility and hope. In the distance, she could hear the soft chiming of the church bells marking the hour, a sound that had once reminded her of time passing and opportunities lost. Now it spoke of time as a gift, of moments to be treasured and memories to be made. Arthur's love had transcended death, bringing together two hearts that needed each other more than they had ever known. And in finding each other, Elizabeth and Maya had discovered that the greatest gifts often come disguised as the deepest losses, and that the most beautiful families are sometimes born from the ashes of grief. The story of Elizabeth Carter had become the story of Elizabeth and Maya Carter Arthur, a family created by love, loss, and the unwavering belief that even in the darkest moments, hope can light the way home.